So we have mobilised and we've stabilised for our shoulders and our pushing and pulling patterns. Now, this is about the time where we integrate our pulling and pushing movements into our training, and instead of going for the bland old push-up and teaching you the basics of that, let's try some more challenging versions of things that are going to step off from our floor press in our stabilisation section, that are going to challenge our single sides, our asymmetries, and our trunk stability and balance. The reason being is if we work on these harder exercises and variants, it should make things like push-ups a lot easier to achieve. Now, first of all, we're going to work with horizontal pushing, being the single arm bench press, which stems from our single arm floor press we've done. So simply challenging that anti-rotation component, i.e. not getting pulled off the bench and working a single side, will have a great crossover for push-ups and our bench press on a barbell. So going into a loaded position, a lying position here, simply starting dumbbell above the shoulder, we're going 45 away, elbow 45 away, from the body, pressing up. So we're going into full range there and then driving up to that start position. Now, if you're someone with shoulder issues, we want to make sure we can go into full range before we start to press, and we are driving up like so. Now, that anti-rotational component is to not let you rotate off the bench before we get out into that top movement. Bracing through the core, or the midsection, and there we have it. So load that up as much as you need to feel the effects of it. Do these as a warm-up before you go into your barbell bench press, push-ups and things like that. That isolates the sides, it highlights any issues with your scapular patterning or your shoulder mobility that you need to address. Go back, address those through the trigger point and mobility section, and then reintegrate that back into a training. You should notice those fixed position, i.e. barbell or push-up movements should become a lot easier. Vertical pushing, unlike horizontal pushing, it is going to put more demand on our shoulder mobility and stability overhead. So before we start, make sure we've gone through the clearing and the testing, the mobilisation work and our stability work to make sure we're strong overhead. Loaded carries, things like that, where you're carrying things over your head in a static or fixed arm position are super handy. But let's go through a couple of pressing varieties with the kettlebell, which will help improve your overhead stability. Now, we're going to start in our tall kneeling stance again. So we're going to challenge trunk stability whilst moving dynamically through the shoulders before we take it to standing. Now, we're going to get that belt, and we're simply going to get it into this start position. Our forearms vertical and our wrist is pushed against the bell, and our wrist doesn't pull back against the bell either. We're pulling away from that kettlebell. Now from here, bracing through the midsection, we're going to follow that J curve or that J pattern to that overhead position. Bicep in line with the ear, coming back down and back into position like so. We can then take that into a half kneeling position where we simply raise a knee and press overhead. Now, it's not about going too heavy here, it's about following that nice natural pattern of the shoulder. And pressing comfortably, same way you go down is the same way you come up. Now this is going to isolate obviously this hip, and if we have trouble stabilising when we're pressing overhead, we want to lower that weight and make sure we have no real big hip shift that's compensating for a particular reason. Now, let's work about functioning that grip strength in that overhead press. Now, this is the bottoms up press. The reason why we do this, by grabbing that bell in a bottoms up position, it functions our grip strength, which causes a principle called irradiation, meaning gripping here gives us strength through the chain to allow us to press the bell. Simple principle of squeezing. We can also use the opposite hand to squeeze, grabbing more tension, giving us more pressing ability. This will also highlight particularly that shoulder stability and mobility because we're using more force through the press. Now, the bottoms up press, the trick to setting up, It's getting on top of that bell. Now, if we've got greasy hands, that's going to be hard. Chalk works very well here. We can get on top of the bell, and the idea is that wrist is forcing into the bell handle. You can see that direct straight line there. So once we force into the bell, we're going to adopt that push-up position to make sure we are in position there. Now, without releasing that grip we've just established, we're going to hike that belt into that start position and press. And bringing it down under control. Now, the trick isn't weight with this particular press. You need to be able to function that grip to keep that bell vertical. Now, if that bell slips or you lose it out of position, just go to a lighter bell. Chalk up, make sure those hands are nice and dry, and go from there. Work slowly and increase the weight as you can maintain that grip strength throughout. You will definitely know you'll have a stronger side out of left and right. So take your time to get into that nice strong starting press position. Find out which is your weak side. Work that appropriately. Don't go heavy early because that bell's just going to fall out. The bell will simply trigger that grip strength to release, and it'll fall by the wayside if it's too heavy. Now, the other press we can work, which is all about that lat shelf and making sure we've got that strong lat position in our press, is our waiter's press. Now, bringing that bell up, remember it's not about weight, but if we've got a heavier bell, we can hike it into position here where we're like so. Now, the wrist is directly under the bulb of that bell and our lat is switched on. So from here, pressing overhead, we can see we're in that waiter's position, and this is why it's called a waiter's press. So coming back down and pressing overhead. Now, the trick is to not let that bell fall out left and right because we don't have the grip right around it. And coming out under control. Now, that'll work that lat shelf. Remember, it's not about weight as such, it's more about efficient movement through the position. You can regress that bottoms up press and that waiter's press to tall kneeling and half kneeling if you want to really slow it down and work that nice smooth range. There's your pushing varieties for your overhead press. Integrating pulling movements into our training, working specifically for the horizontal variety. Now, we're not going to touch on the vertical variety in this particular portion, pull-ups and other variants, because we want to earn that strength in our horizontal pull before we move to vertical pulling. Reason being, that strong scapular position and that strong horizontal row puts us in a good stead to lift our body weight and things like that in vertical pulling. So as we're integrating this into our training, these are some horizontal rowing varieties or pulling exercises that you can use that will give you that strength in that horizontal range, which will make your vertical pulling and postural control in those vertical pulls a lot better. First one is our inverted row. Now, you can do this on a TRX, gym rings and the like, but I really love the barbell version or the fixed bar version because it forces you to get into that strong position by having a fixed hand position on a barbell. So we can't sort of manipulate and sort of creep through the movement on a TRX because we're fixed into position. Now, we're going to lay on our back underneath that barbell, making sure you don't bump your head. And we can go in an undergrasp, meaning palms facing towards us, or an overgrasp position. I would recommend undergrasp first, because this is usually where we're stronger. And then from here, we can have bent legs if we need it, but we're pulling ourselves up to that bar. Now, it might take a couple of reps to find position, but we should be maintaining a straight line between elbow and shoulders, and we should be rowing, pulling those elbows to the hips, past the hips, sorry. So working that position, if we feel like we fatigue, we can grab bent knees, make that a little bit easier. We can work from there. We can then move to an overgrasp position, and this will inherently make that pulling or finish part of the movement harder. So we go back to that straight leg stance, and we're pulling to that top of the movement. The trick is that nice pause at the top. Now, that's our inverted row. On a barbell is inherently much harder than a TRX. So if you're just beginning your journey, jump on a TRX. Walk your feet away from the anchor point a little bit and increase the ease of which you can complete it. So don't fight hard until you're ready to. So now, after we work on our inverted row on a barbell or a TRX, we can use dumbbells or kettlebells, and we can use a different foot position. So a staggered stance, symmetrical stance for different outcomes. And we can also have some anti-rotational component in there with alternate rows, which will challenge and keep our midline stability intact throughout our pulling movements. Now the first one is our lunge row. I'm going to start with a single kettlebell here. I'm going to put our foot beside that bell. We're going to take a big lunging step back, and all we're simply doing is rowing to our hip. Now the reason why we row to our hip, that's going to cause that shoulder to pull the full range as opposed to trying to pull and cheat the range through there. So by rowing to our hip, we are challenging that split stance and stability, so there's a bit of anti-rotation in there, and it's also going to make our lives a lot easier when we go to Renegade rows and gorilla rows, which we'll get onto shortly. The next one is our standard bent over row. We're back into that symmetrical stance, and we are loading into that hinge, and we can row together or alternate. Now, the trick here is maintaining that hinge position, loaded through the hamstrings, weight shifted to the heels, making sure we don't round our back, and maintaining that neutral spine. Our first really high impact row version, which I love, is our gorilla row. Now, this is the level before our Renegade row, which we'll get onto very shortly. But this is in that bent over row position, but we can go quite heavy because there's a start and stop component, meaning the bell goes to the floor every rep. So we're in that hinge position, hands are on the bells, and we're rowing. So the bell that doesn't move is on the floor, and we're rowing to our hip again. So by having the bell on the floor, you can force into it and create more strength on the bell you're pulling, which should allow you to go heavier. The final version, which is always the one people hate to do, particularly when they're beginning their journey because it challenges a lot of stability, is the Renegade row. We're going to start in our push-up position over the top of those bells. Now the trick is here to have your feet wide enough that you can maintain a nice flat line without letting it rotate you out of position. So forcing into the bell that isn't moving, we're rowing to our hip again. And we're alternating under control. So by forcing into the bell that isn't moving, that keeps you nice and stable and allows you to avoid too much rotation throughout the movement. Like with these though, if you're using kettlebells with a small base, don't do them because you're going to slip off and hurt yourself. So you can use dumbbells that have a flat surface that you can rest on the ground, or kettlebells with a wide enough base like our competition style bells, and then you should be good to go.